Hello and welcome to another TLDR US video. For years now, a battle has been occurring between President Donald Trump and his Democratic and legal opponents over his tax returns. On Thursday, the Supreme Court finally delivered a ruling on them. Well, actually two rulings on them, or at least on one angle of them. It's complicated. Anyway, in this video, we'll take a look at the current situation and what it means for Trump and his administration. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to be notified when our future videos are released. And if you are new around here, be sure to check out our videos on similar topics, including Supreme Court rulings, other factors impacting Trump's success in 2020, and how much we can trust polling. Thanks for your support, and all of these videos are linked down below. Okay, so let's start with some backstory on the tax returns. For months now, New York County District Attorney Cyrus Vance has been attempting to acquire Trump's tax returns in an investigation concerning the president's personal finances and hush money payments that were made before the 2016 election. In 2019, Vance, acting on behalf of a New York grand jury, issued a subpoena to Trump's accounting firm, Mazars USA, as well as to Deutsche Bank and Capital One, demanding 8 years of the president's tax returns. Trump, unsurprisingly, was not particularly pleased by this turn of events, and quickly set out to block Vance's acquisitions of said tax returns. Trump's personal attorneys, for their part, have been following an argument set forth in an opinion by the Office of Legal Counsel, that as President of the United States, Trump is immune from any and all criminal prosecution, and crucially, all investigation during his time as president. This is a fairly unprecedented argument, and it quickly drew criticism from across the board. Vance's office argued that this stance put the president above the law, a situation which most can agree would be bad. Trump, however, asserted that his potential immunity was simply the correct interpretation of the law. Whatever the interpretation, though, things didn't exactly end up going Trump's way. In its ruling on Thursday morning, the Supreme Court sided 7-2 with Vance, declaring that the state had the right to issue subpoenas against the president, and that Trump didn't have the blanket of immunity that he claimed. As such, Vance and the corresponding grand jury will be able to further pursue the requested documents through the court system. So that's it. Trump's tax returns are maybe coming. Story over, right? Well, no, not really. This situation is complicated for a couple of reasons. First is the fact that even if the grand jury is successful in its quest for Trump's tax returns, everyone else still won't be able to see them. Second is the issue that we previously mentioned, the other ruling. Because while the tax return story broke as a single entity, there were two different sets of subpoenas. The first, which we already discussed, are those from the New York District Attorney. The second, however, came from Congress. House Democrats have been trying to access Trump's tax returns for ages, and 3 House committees submitted a wide-ranging set of subpoenas. But in the ruling on Thursday, again by a 7-2 margin, the Supreme Court ruled that the issue of Congress's subpoenas was to be sent back down to lower courts to examine said subpoenas, and whether or not they serve any legitimate legislative purpose. Essentially, the House has to prove that it needs the financial documents for reasons beyond politics and election maneuvering. We'll take a look at what that all means for the future in a moment, but first, let's take a look at the 2 votes that went against the majority, because in both cases, the same 2 voices dissented: Justices Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito. In their dissenting opinions for the case surrounding the congressional subpoenas, Justices Thomas and Alito argued that Congress needed to outline the legislation it was planning on using the subpoenaed documents to craft, so as to prove they were not exercising their power improperly. This is actually quite a similar argument to the one made by the majority, just with more specificity and a higher bar for Congress. In the Vance case, the 2 asserted that while the president is not immune from investigation or prosecution, in this case, the subpoena could interfere with his duties and should thus not be granted, using the established argument that a president should not be prosecuted if it interferes with their ability to govern. Thomas and Alito's dissents, though, were certainly interesting from a legal perspective, and likely weren't something that Chief Justice John Roberts was particularly happy to see, and not just because they disagreed with him. This is because despite the theoretically apolitical nature of the court, the Supreme Court still has some politics to consider. The court generally tries to establish its independence from the leadership of both parties, even when one ideology has a majority in the court, as the Conservatives do now. And Roberts had clearly been thinking carefully about this throughout the last term of rulings. Through a series of decisions in which Roberts took a stance against various propositions that Trump was arguing for, Roberts has fairly successfully set himself up as separate from the party that nominated him, and as the president who currently serves as that party's head. And though we, quite disappointingly, cannot see inside Roberts' mind, it's probably safe to say that this term's season finale of a ruling on Trump's tax returns was meant to position him and his court firmly in the middle of the two ideologies. By giving Vance the opportunity to access tax returns, while denying Congress access, for now at least, Roberts gave each party a win and each a loss. Because of this, a consensus 9-0 decision certainly would have been preferable to show real impartiality. But enough Supreme Court analysis. What does this all mean for Trump's taxes? Basically, it means that we'll have to keep waiting. It's unlikely that the congressional subpoenas will make their way back to the lower courts fast enough for any definitive conclusion to be reached before the election. And since any information given to the New York grand jury will not be released publicly, we're probably not going to see any information through that channel either. Essentially, we're probably not going to see any tax returns before the election. Despite this, it's probably worth taking a moment to look at what's likely within the documents that Trump is so desperately trying to keep private. There's basically two possible extreme realities here, with a more realistic spectrum between them. So let's take a look at both of those extremes. In scenario 1, everything legally checks out for Trump. He didn't do anything illegal, he can't reasonably be prosecuted or sued, and he doesn't have any financial information that could be electorally damaging. This, however, is quite unlikely for a few reasons, the main one being the desperation with which Trump is trying to hide his financial records. Though it's not legally required, every president since Nixon has released their tax returns, and though Trump promised to do so in 2016, he never actually did. And both through the Supreme Court case and various other means, he's sought to thoroughly conceal them from the public. Perhaps he's just being stubborn, but as the saying goes, you only worry if you have something to hide. Which brings us to option 2. Everything Vance is investigating and more turns out to be true. Among other things, Trump broke campaign finance laws, bribed porn stars to stay quiet about affairs, and is a lot less rich than he claims to be. This would all be devastating for the president, especially if it came out before the election. On the other hand, that's great if you're a Democrat. And strangely enough, it might not even be the breaking of rules which would hurt Trump the most politically if this scenario came to be true. One of the traits that made so many people vote for Trump in 2016 were his credentials as a businessman. If it turned out that his finances were in fact in much worse shape than he said, it's likely that we'd see some sort of dent in his public opinion, which, given he's already in a precarious position, probably isn't something that he'd like. It's also worth noting that Trump is already not in a good place when it comes to his tax returns specifically. In a Pew Research report released at the end of last month, 56% of voters said that Trump had a responsibility to release his tax returns. So that leaves Trump in a lose-lose situation here. Either he releases his tax returns, which presumably are at least in some way or another unflattering, or he continues hiding them, and by doing so, sides against the majority of Americans. Either way, things aren't looking particularly good for him here. But with Thursday's ruling behind us, it's probably safe to say that those tax returns are, at least for the foreseeable future, staying hidden. That said, given the number of other, slightly more significant issues swirling around this year, it's probably safe to say that in one way or another, the election won't swing on the issue of Trump's taxes. As we mentioned in a recent video outlining the issues that Trump may have getting re-elected, there's a link in the description to that, wink wink nod nod. Despite all of the drama surrounding the case and subsequent court decisions, this may end up being a total non-issue in November. But hey, if there's anything that 2020's taught us, it's that 4 months is a literal eternity. So who even knows for sure? Let us know your thoughts on this situation. Should Trump release his tax returns, or is that something that presidents just shouldn't be responsible for doing? Also, if you want to stay up to date with all of the latest Washington drama, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon to be notified whenever we post a new video. Special thanks to our Patreon backers, whose support makes these videos possible. Find out more and get your name listed at the end of the videos by clicking the link to the Patreon in the description.